Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Reading Rainbows, where we're reading Inkheart by Cornelia Funke. Today we're going to read chapters 20 and 21 because they're each about 10 pages. So, let's get started. Chapter 20, Snakes and Thorns. None of that matters now, said Twilight. Look behind you. The Barbles did, and there, just a little beyond the rim of the bridge, they saw a halo of harsh whiteness reflected on the underneath of the dark sky. It was the beam of a car's headlights as it got into position on the north side of the bridge, the side the runaways had left only moments before. That's by Michael de Larrabite. The Barbles Go for Broke. Behind them, the headlights were getting closer, no matter how fast Eleanor drove. It could be just any old car, said Meggie, but she knew that was unlikely. There was only one village on the bumpy, potholed road they had been following for almost an hour, and that was Capricorn's. Their pursuers could only have come from there. Now what? Asked Eleanor. She was in such a state the car was weaving all over the road. I'm not letting them lock me up in that hole again. No, no, no. At each no she struck the steering wheel with the palm of her hand. Didn't you say you'd slit their tires? She snapped at Dustfinger. Yes, and so I did, he replied angrily. Obviously they've thought of that kind of thing. Ever heard of spare tires? Go on, step on it. There ought to be a village quite soon. It can't be far away now, if we can make it that far. If. Yes, if is the question, said Eleanor, tapping the fuel gauge. I've got enough gas for about another 10 kilometers. 20 at the most. But they never got that far. As they swerved around a sharp bend, one of the front tires blew out. Eleanor only just managed to wrench the steering wheel around before the car skidded off the road. Meggie screamed, burying her face in her hands. For a terrible moment she thought they were going to plunge down the steep slope to their left, the bottom of which disappeared in the darkness. But the car skidded to the right, scraped its fender against the low stone wall on the other side of the road, gave a last gasp, and came to a halt under the low branches of a chestnut oak that leaned over the road. Oh, hell, hell, bloody hell, swore Eleanor, undoing her seatbelt. Everyone all right? Now I know why I've never trusted cars, muttered Dustfinger, opening his door. Well, I mean, cars are quite safe if you're not, in a race for your life, trying to run away from somebody. Meggie sat there, trembling all over. Mo pulled her out of the car and looked anxiously at her face. Are you all right? Meggie nodded. Farid climbed out on Dustfinger's side. Did he still think he was dreaming? Dustfinger stood in the road, backpack over his shoulder, listening. The unmistakable sound of an engine came piercing through the night from far away. We must get the car off the road, he said. What? Eleanor looked at him in horror. We have to push it down the slope. My car! Eleanor was almost screaming. He's right, Eleanor, said Mo. Perhaps we can shake them off that way. We'll push the car down the slope. They may not notice it in the dark, and even if they do, they'll think we went off the road. Then we can climb up the hill on the other side and hide among the trees. Eleanor cast a doubtful glance at the hill on their right. But it's much too steep. And what about the snakes? I'm sure Basta has a new knife by now, Dustfinger reminded her. Eleanor gave him her darkest look and, without another word, went around to the back of her car to check inside the trunk. Where's our luggage? She asked. Dustfinger looked at her with amusement. I expect Basta's divided it out among Capricorn's maid. I expect Basta's divided it out among Capricorn's maids. He likes to ingratiate himself with them.
Eleanor looked at him as if she didn't believe a word of it, but then quickly closed the trunk, braced her arms against the car, and began to push. They couldn't do it. Hard as they pushed and shoved, Eleanor's car only rolled off the road, but would not slide more than a few meters down the slope. Then it stopped with its hood stuck in the undergrowth and refused to go any farther. Meanwhile, the sound of an engine, so curiously out of place in this desolate wilderness, was getting alarmingly loud. Dustfinger gave the obstinate car a final kick, and they all clambered back up the road, sweating. After climbing over an ancient wall on the other side, they struggled on up the slope. Anything to get away from the road itself. Mo hauled Meggie along behind him whenever she got stuck, and Dustfinger helped forward. Eleanor had her work cut out getting herself up the hillside, which was crisscrossed with low walls that had been built in a laborious attempt to wrest narrow fields and orchards from the poor soil. Somewhere to grow a few olive trees and grapevines, anything that would bear fruit here. But the trees had run wild, and the ground was covered with fruit that was no longer harvested, for the people who once lived here had long since left to find an easier life elsewhere. "Keep your heads down," gasped Dustfinger, ducking behind one of the ruined walls. "They're coming!" Mo pulled Meggie down under the nearest tree. The tangled thorn bushes growing among its gnarled roots were just tall enough to hide them. "What about the snakes?" Eleanor whispered as she stumbled after them. "Too cold for snakes at the moment," whispered Dustfinger from his hiding place. "Haven't you learned anything from all those clever books of yours?" Eleanor was about to snap back an answer, but Mo had quickly put a hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. The vehicle appeared on the road below them. It was the white delivery van in which the guard had been sleeping. Without slowing down, it drove past the place where they had pushed Eleanor's car over the slope and disappeared around the next bend. Relieved, Meggie was about to raise her head above the thorn bushes when Mo pushed her down again. "Not yet," he muttered, straining his ears. The night was perfectly still. Meggie had never known one like it. It was as if she could hear the trees breathing, the trees, the grass, the night itself. They watched the van headlights emerge on the slope of the next hill, 2 fingers of light groping their way along an invisible road in the dark. But suddenly they stopped moving. "They're turning," whispered Eleanor. "Oh God, now what?" They're not very accomplished at escaping, are they? I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Never mind me. She tried to stand up, but Mo held her back. "Are you mad?" he hissed. "It's too late to climb any farther. They'd see us." Mo was right. The delivery van was speeding back up the road. Meggie saw it stop just a few meters from where they had pushed Eleanor's car off the road. She heard the van doors open and saw 2 men get out. Both had their backs to the fugitives, but when one of them turned and looked suspiciously up the slopes, Meggie thought she recognized Basta's face, though it was little more than a patch of paler color in the night. "There's the car," said the other man. Was that Flatnose? He was certainly tall and broad enough. "See if they're in it." Yes, that was Basta. Meggie would have known his voice among 1,000 others. Flatnose made his way down the slope, clumsy as a bear. Meggie heard him cursing the thorns, the prickles, the darkness, and the wretched riffraff he was having to stumble after in the middle of the night. Basta was still standing in the road, his face sharply outlined when he lit a cigarette with a lighter. The white smoke drifted up to them until Meggie thought she could almost smell it. "They're not here," called Flatnose. "They must have gotten away on foot." "Hell, do you think we have to follow them?" Basta went over to the roadside and looked down. Then he turned and looked up at the slope where Meggie was crouching beside Mo, her heart thudding wildly. "They can't have gotten far," he said, "but it'll be difficult to find their trail in the dark." "Exactly." Flatnose was panting as he appeared back on the road. "We're not bloody native trackers, are we?" Stereotypes abound. Basta did not reply. He just stood there, listening and inhaling his cigarette smoke. Then he whispered something to Flatnose. Maggie's heart almost stopped. Flatnose looked around anxiously. "Nah, let's get the dogs instead," Maggie heard him say. "Even if they're hiding somewhere around here, how do we know whether they'd climbed up or down?" Basta glanced at the trees, looked down the road, and trod out his cigarette. Then he went back to the van and took out 2 shotguns. "We'll try going down first," he said, tossing Flatnose one of the guns. "I'm sure that fat woman would rather climb downhill." And without another word, he vanished into the darkness. Flatnose cast the van a longing glance, then trudged after him, grumbling. The 2 were barely out of sight before Dustfinger rose to his feet, soundless as a shadow, and pointed up the slope. Maggie's heart was beating in her throat as they followed him. They darted from tree to tree, from bush to bush, constantly looking behind them. Every time a twig cracked underfoot, Maggie jumped, but luckily Basta and Flatnose were making a fair amount of noise themselves as they worked their way downhill through the undergrowth. Well, it works out to their advantage that Basta and Flatnose are like, "Oh no, it would be easier for them to go downhill, so, that's the way we'll go," but yeah. Still, rather tense. A time came when they couldn't see the road anymore, but their fear did not leave them, the fear that Basta might have turned back already and was now following them uphill. Yet, however often they stopped and listened, all they could hear was their own breathing. They'll soon realize they've gone the wrong way," Dustfinger whispered after a while. "Then they'll go back for the dogs. We're lucky they didn't bring them in the first place. Basta doesn't think much of those dogs, and he's right. I've fed them cheese often enough, and cheese dulls a dog's nose. All the same, he'll fetch them sooner or later because even Basta doesn't like taking bad news back to Capricorn." Then we must just go faster," said Mo. If you're already going all out, it's hard to say we'll go faster, but whatever. "Go faster where?" Eleanor was still fighting for breath. Dustfinger looked around. Maggie wondered why. She could hardly make out anything. It was so dark. "We must keep going south," said Dustfinger, "toward the coast. We must hide among other people. That's the only thing that can save us. Down there the nights are bright and nobody believes in the devil." Farood was standing beside Maggie, gazing at the night sky as if he could make morning come or find the people Dustfinger had mentioned somewhere, but there wasn't a light to be seen in the darkness, except for the tangle of stars sparkling cold and distant in the heavens. For a moment, Maggie felt as if those stars were eyes giving away their presence, and imagined she could hear them whispering, "Look, Basta, there they go, down there. Quick, catch them." They stumbled on, keeping close together so that no one would get lost. Dustfinger had taken Gwyn out of his pack and put him on his chain before letting him run alongside them. The marten didn't seem to like it. Dustfinger had to keep hauling him out of the undergrowth, away from all the promising scents that their human noses couldn't pick up. The marten spat and snarled with annoyance, biting and tearing at the chain. "Curse the little brute, I'm sure to fall over it," said Eleanor crossly. "Can't you keep it away from under my sore feet? I tell you one thing, the moment we're in a decent human company again, I'm going to take the best hotel room money can buy and put my poor feet up on a big soft cushion." "I know that feeling. After spending a week walking around in Disney World, my feet were so sore. All I wanted to do was sit with my feet up and just do nothing. You've still got money on you? Mo sounded incredulous. They took all mine first thing. Oh yes, Basta took my wallet too, said Eleanor, but I think ahead. I have my credit card somewhere safe. Is anywhere safe from Basta? Dustfinger dragged Gwen away from a tree trunk. Oh yes, replied Eleanor. Men are never particularly keen to search fat old ladies, which can be useful. That was how some of my most valuable books came into my... She interrupted herself abruptly, clearing her throat when her eyes fell on Maggie. But Maggie acted as if she hadn't heard Eleanor's last remark, or at least hadn't understood what she meant. Okay, I can understand, where she may have hidden money. Yeah, the old, using the bra as a pocketbook trick. I mean, I had a teacher once who really used her bra as a pocketbook. Yeah, someone asked to borrow some money, and teacher reaches down in her bra and pulls out chalkboard eraser, pulls out a couple pieces of chalk, pulls out her car keys, before finally pulling out, some money. Yeah, that's really using the bra as a pocketbook. However, Eleanor's saying that, that was how some of her most valuable books came into her possession. Where exactly is she hiding these books? 'Cause I'm sorry, unless you've got like triple Z-sized boobs, I don't see how you could be using the bra to smuggle books or anything like that. So what? How? You're not all that fat, Maggie said, and old is a bit of an exaggeration. Oh, how her own feet hurt. Well, thank you very much, darling, said Eleanor. I think I'll buy you from your father so you can say nice things like that to me 3 times a day. How much do you want for her, Mo? I'll have to think about it, replied Mo. Suppose I lend her to you for a few days now and then? They chatted like this, voices scarcely raised above a whisper, as they struggled through the thorny growth on the hillside. It didn't matter what they talked about, for their hushed conversation had only one purpose, to fend off the fear and exhaustion that was weighing down all their limbs. On and on they walked, hoping that Dustfinger knew where he was taking them. Maggie kept close behind Mo all the time. At least his back offered some protection from the thorny branches that kept catching at her clothes and scratching her face, like vicious animals with needle-sharp claws lying in wait in the dark. At last they came upon a footpath that they could follow. It was littered with empty cartridge cases dropped by hunters who had dealt out death in this silent place. Walking was easier on the trodden earth, although Maggie was so tired she could hardly pick up her feet. When she stumbled against the back of Mo's legs for the second time, he put her on his back and carried her as he used to do before she could keep up with his long legs. He'd called her Little Flea in those days, or Feather Girl, or Tinker Bell after the fairy in Peter Pan. Sometimes he still called her Tinker Bell. Wearily, Maggie rested her face against his shoulders and tried to think of Peter Pan instead of snakes, or men with knives. But this time, her own story was too strong to give way to an invented one. Mo was right. Fear devours everything. It was a long time since Farid had said anything. Most of the time he stumbled along after Dustfinger. He seemed to have taken a fancy to Gwen. Whenever the marten's chain got caught up somewhere, Farid would rush to free him, even if Gwen only hissed at him in return and snapped at his fingers. Once he sank his teeth into the boy's thumb and made it bleed. "Well, do you still think this is a dream?" asked Dustfinger ironically as Farid wiped the blood away. The boy didn't answer, just examined his sore thumb. Then he sucked it and spat. "What else could it be?" he asked. Dustfinger looked at Mo, but he seemed so deep in thought he didn't notice the glance. "How about another story?" said Dustfinger. Farood laughed. "Another story? I like that idea. I've always been fond of stories." "Oh, yes? And how do you like this one?" "Too many thorns, and I wish it would get light. But at least I haven't had to work yet. That's something." Maggie couldn't help smiling. A bird called in the distance. Gwyn stopped and raised his round muzzle, sniffing the air. The night belongs to beasts of prey, and always has. It's easy to forget that when you're indoors, protected by light and solid walls. Night provides cover for hunters, making it easy for them to creep up and strike their prey blind. Words about the night from one of her favorite books slipped into Maggie's mind. This is the hour of pride and power, talon and claw. She snuggled her face against Mo's shoulder once more. Perhaps I should walk again, she thought. He's been carrying me for so long. But then she nodded off to sleep, still perched on his back. Give me just a moment here. Mouth's drying out a little. Chapter 21, Basta. This grove, that was now so peaceful, must then have rung with cries, I thought, and even with the thought I could believe I heard it ringing still. Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island. Maggie woke up when Mo stopped. The path had brought them almost to the crest of the hill. It was still dark, but the night was growing paler, as if lifting her skirts a little way off to let the new morning appear. "We must take a breather, Dustfinger," Maggie heard Mo saying. "The boy can hardly keep up. Eleanor's feet must need a rest, and if you ask me, this wouldn't be a bad place for one." "What feet?" asked Eleanor, sinking to the ground with a groan. "You mean those poor, sore objects attached to my leg?" "That's what I mean," said Mo as he pulled her up again. "But they must go just a little farther. We'll rest up there." A good 50 meters to their left, at the very top of the hill, there was a house, if you could call it that, huddled among the olive trees. Top of the hill. Good place, 'cause then you can see down all around you to see what's coming and better protect yourself. So, I approve. Maggie slipped off Mo's back before they climbed up to it. The walls looked as if someone had piled up a number of stones in a hurry. The roof had collapsed, and where there must have once been a door, only a black hole now gaped. Mo had to bend low to make his way in. Broken shingles from the roof covered the floor. There was an empty sack in a corner, some broken earthenware shards, perhaps from a dish or a plate, and a few bones gnawed clean. Mo sighed. "Not a very comfortable place, Maggie," he said, "but try imagining you're hiding out with the Lost Boys or in Huckleberry Finn's tub." Maggie looked around. "I think I'd rather sleep outside all the same." Eleanor came in. The accommodation didn't seem to appeal much to her either. Mo gave Maggie a kiss and went back to the door. "Believe me, it'll be safer in here," he said. Maggie looked at him in concern. "Where are you going? You have to get some sleep too." "Oh, I'm not tired." His face gave away his lie. "Go to sleep now, all right?" Then he went out again. Eleanor pushed the broken shingles aside with her foot. "Come on," she said, taking off her jacket and spreading it on the floor. "Let's try to make ourselves comfortable together. Your father's right. We must just imagine we're somewhere else." "Why are adventures so much more fun when you read about them?" she murmured, stretching out on the floor. I know why they're more fun when you're just reading about them. It's because you can be nice and safe and warm in your bed while reading about someone else having a hardship, rather than having to suffer the hardship yourself. There's your buzzkill answer for the day. Cautiously, Maggie lay down beside her. "At least it isn't raining," remarked Eleanor, looking at the collapsed roof. "And we have the stars above us, even if they're fading. Perhaps I ought to have a few holes knocked in my own roof at home." With an impatient nod, she told Maggie to lay her head on her arm. "In case any spiders try crawling into your ears while you're asleep," she said, closing her eyes. "Oh, Lord," Maggie heard her add in a murmur. "I'll have to buy a new pair of feet, I really will. There's no hope for these." With that, she was asleep. "I wish you could just buy a new pair of feet, or in my case, new knees. Ugh, my knees are always so sore and achy and just all out painful. I wish I could just get new knees so that I don't have to deal with these anymore, but it's not that easy, I'm afraid." But Maggie lay with her eyes wide open, listening to the sounds outside. She heard Mo talking quietly to Dustfinger, but she couldn't make out the words. Once she thought she heard Basta's name. The boy Farid had stayed outside too, but he made no sound. Eleanor began snoring after only minutes, but hard as Maggie tried, she couldn't get to sleep. So she got up quietly and slipped outside. Mo was awake, sitting with his back against a tree, watching the morning light drive the night from the sky above the surrounding hills. Dustfinger was sitting a little farther off. He raised his head only briefly when Maggie came out of the hut. Was he thinking of the fairies and the goblins? Farid lay beside him, curled up like a dog, and Gwyn was sitting at his feet eating something. Maggie quickly turned her head away. Dawn was breaking over the hills, casting light on summit after summit. Maggie saw houses in the distance, scattered like toys on the green slopes. The sea must lie somewhere beyond them. She put her head on Mo's lap and looked up at his face. "They won't find us here, will they?" she asked. "No, of course not," he said, but his face wasn't half as carefree as his voice. "Why aren't you asleep in there with Eleanor?" "She snores," murmured Maggie. Mo smiled. Then, frowning, he looked down the hillside to the place where the path lay, hidden by rock roses, brambles, and thorns. Dustfinger never took his eyes off the path either. The sight of the two men on watch made Maggie feel better, and soon she was sleeping as deeply as Farid, as if the ground outside the tumble-down house were covered with downy feathers instead of thorns. When Mo shook her awake, at first she thought it had all just been a bad dream. But his hand was over her mouth. He was holding a finger to his lips in warning. Maggie heard the rustle of grass and the barking of a dog. Mo pulled her to her feet and pushed her and Farid into the shelter of the dark hovel. Eleanor was still snoring. She looked like a young girl with the light of dawn on her face, but as soon as Mo had woken her, all her weariness, anxiety, and fear came rushing back. Mo and Dustfinger stationed themselves by the doorway, one to the left and the other to the right, their backs pressed to the wall. Men's voices broke the quiet of the morning. Maggie thought she could hear the dogs sniffing and wished she could dissolve into thin air, odorless and invisible air. Farid stood beside her, his eyes wide. Maggie noticed for the first time that they were almost black. She had never seen such dark eyes, and his lashes were as long as a girl's. "I have 2 sons. Both of them have very long lashes. I hate this, 'oh, you have lashes like a girl' business." Yeah, my boys especially hate it because, besides their long eyelashes, they also have long hair. So they're always hearing that sort of stuff. Eleanor was leaning against the wall opposite, biting her lips nervously. Dustfinger made a sign to Mo, and before Meggie realized what their plan was, they made their way out. The olive trees where they took cover were stunted, with matted branches hanging almost to the ground, as if the weight of their leaves was too much for them. A child could easily have hidden behind them, but did they provide enough shelter for 2 grown men? Meggie peered out of the doorway. Her heart was beating so fast that it almost suffocated her. Outside, the sun was rising higher and higher. Daylight crept into every valley, beneath every tree, and suddenly Meggie wished for the night again. Mo was kneeling down so his head wouldn't be seen above the tangled branches. Dustfinger was pressed hard against a crooked tree trunk, and there, terrifyingly close, 20 paces at most away from the two of them, was Basta. He was making his way up the slope through thistles and knee-high grass. "They'll have reached the valley by now," Meggie heard a rough voice call, and next moment Flatnose appeared beside Basta. They had brought 2 vicious-looking dogs with them. Meggie saw the dogs' broad skulls pushing through the grass and heard them snuffling. "What, with 2 children and that fat woman?" "Sorry," Basta's voice. "What, with 2 children and that fat woman?" Basta shook his head and looked around. Furred peered past Meggie and flinched back as if something had bitten him when he saw the 2 men. "Basta?" Soundlessly, Eleanor's lips formed his name. Meggie nodded, and Eleanor went even paler than she was already. "Damn it, Basta! How much longer are you going to trudge around here?" Flatnose's voice echoed a long way in the silence that lay over the hills. "The snakes will soon be waking up, and I'm hungry. Let's just say they fell into the valley with the car. We'll give it another push and no one will find out. The snakes will probably get them anyway, and if not, then they'll lose their way, starve, get sunstroke. Oh, who cares what happens? But anyway, we'll never see them again." "He's been feeding them cheese!" Basta furiously hauled the dogs to his side. "That bloody little fire-eater's been feeding them cheese to ruin their noses. But nobody would believe me. No wonder they whine with joy every time they see his ugly mug." "You beat them too much," grunted Flatnose. "That's why they don't work for you. Dogs don't like being beaten." "Nonsense. You have to beat them or they'll bite you." "They'll be more likely to bite you if you beat 'em, you Nimrod." "They like the fire-eater because he's like them. He whines, he's sly, and he bites." One of the dogs lay down in the grass and licked its paws. Angrily, Basta kicked it in the ribs and hauled it to its feet. "You can go back to the village if you like," he spat at Flatnose, "but I'm going to get that fire-eater and cut off all his fingers one by one. Then we'll see how cleverly he can juggle. I always said he couldn't be trusted, but the boss thought his little tricks with fire were so entertaining." Okay. Everyone knows you can't stand him." Flatnose sounded bored. "But he may have nothing to do with the disappearance of that bunch. You know he's always come and gone as he pleased. Maybe he'll turn up again tomorrow, know nothing about it." "You're right," growled Basta. He walked on. Every step brought him closer to the trees behind which Mo and Dustfinger were hiding. "And Silvertongue stole the fat woman's car key from under my pillow, did he? No, this time no excuses will do Dustfinger any good, because he took something else too, something of mine." Involuntarily, Dustfinger put his hand to his belt, as if he were afraid that Basta's knife could call out to its master. One of the dogs raised its head and tugged Basta on toward the trees. "He's found something." Basta lowered his voice. "The stupid creature's picked up a scent." 10 more paces, perhaps fewer, and he would be among the trees. What were they going to do? What on earth were they going to do? Flatnose was trudging along after Basta with a skeptical expression on his face. "They've probably scented a wild boar," Maggie heard him say. "You want to be careful. They can run you right down." "Oh no, I think I saw a snake there. One of those black snakes. You've got the antidote in the car, right?" He stood there perfectly still, rooted to the spot and staring down at the ground in front of his feet. Basta took no notice of him. He followed the snuffling dog. A few more steps, and Mo would only have to reach out a hand to touch him. Basta unslung the shotgun from his shoulder, stopped, and listened. The dogs pulled to the left and jumped up at one of the tree trunks, barking. Gwyn was up there in the branches. "What did I say?" called Flatnose. "They've scented a marten, that's all. Those brutes stink so strong even I could pick up their smell." "That's no ordinary marten," hissed Basta. "Don't you recognize him?" His eyes were fixed on the ruined hovel. Mo seized his opportunity. He sprang out from behind the tree, seized Basta, and tried to wrench the gun from his hands. Get him, you brutes!" bellowed Basta, and obviously the dogs were willing to obey him this time. They leaped up at Mo, baring their yellow teeth. Before Maggie could run to his aid, Eleanor seized her hand and held her tight no matter how hard she struggled, just as she had done before back in her own house. But this time there was someone else to help Mo. Before the dogs could sink their teeth into him, Dustfinger had grabbed their collars. Maggie thought they would tear him apart when he dragged them off Mo, but instead they licked his hands, jumping up at him like an old friend and almost knocking him down. Yeah, that's the difference between someone who, beats and kicks at them like Basta and someone that, gives them treats and kindness like Dustfinger. I mean, not that I'm defending Dustfinger, but, I'm just pointing out, why they act so mean and vicious to Basta and so nice to Dustfinger. But there was still Flatnose. Luckily, he wasn't too quick on the uptake. That saved them. For a brief moment, he simply stood there staring at Basta, who was still struggling in Mo's grip. Meanwhile, Dustfinger had hauled the dogs over to the nearest tree and was just winding their leashes around the cracked bark when Flatnose came out of his daze. "Let them go," he bellowed, pointing his shotgun at Mo. With a suppressed curse, Dustfinger let the dogs loose, but the stone Farid threw moved faster than he did. It hit Flatnose in the middle of the forehead, an insignificant little stone, but the huge man collapsed in the grass at Dustfinger's feet like a felled tree. "Keep the dogs off me," called Mo as Basta fought to get control of his gun. One of the dogs had bitten Mo's sleeve. At least Maggie hoped it was just his sleeve. Before Eleanor could restrain her again, she ran to the big dog and seized its studded collar. The dog wouldn't let go, however hard she pulled. She saw blood on Mo's arm, and she almost got hit on the head with the barrel of Basta's shotgun. Dustfinger tried to call off the dogs, and at first they obeyed him, or at least they let go of Mo, but then Basta succeeded in freeing himself. "Get him!" he shouted, and the dogs stood there growling, not sure whether to obey Basta or Dustfinger. "Bloody brutes!" shouted Basta, pointing his shotgun at Mo's chest, but at that very moment Eleanor pressed the muzzle of Flatnose's gun against his head. Her hands were shaking, and her face was covered in red blotches, as it always was when she was worked up, but she looked more than determined to use the gun. "Drop the gun, Basta," she said, her voice unsteady, "and not another word to those dogs. I may never have had to use a gun before, but I'm sure I can manage to pull the trigger." "Sit," Dustfinger ordered the dogs. They looked uncertainly at Basta, but when he said nothing, they lay down in the grass and let Dustfinger tie them to the tree. Blood was trickling from Mo's sleeve. Maggie felt herself turn faint at the sight of it. This trope of, girls and women being afraid of blood and all that, I get, being worried that he's hurt and all that, but feeling faint at the sight of blood, just no, stop it. Dustfinger bound up the wound with a red silk scarf that soaked up the blood. It's not as bad as it looks, he assured Maggie as she came closer, feeling weak at the knees. Got anything else in your backpack we can use to tie him up? Asked Mo, nodding at the still unconscious Flatnose. Our friend with the knife here will need some packaging too, said Eleanor. Basta glared at her viciously. Don't stare at me like that, she said, jamming the barrel of the gun into his chest. I'm sure a gun like this can do as much damage as a knife, and believe you me, that gives me some very unpleasant ideas. Basta twisted his mouth scornfully, but he never took his eyes off Eleanor's forefinger, which was still on the trigger. There was a length of cord in Dustfinger's pack, strong if not particularly thick. It won't be enough for both of them, Dustfinger said. Why do you want to tie them up? Inquired Farid. Why not kill them? That's what they were going to do to us. Maggie looked at him in horror, but Basta laughed. Oh, fancy that, he mocked. We could have used that boy after all. But who says we were going to kill you? Capricorn wants you alive. Dead men can't read aloud. Oh, really? And weren't you planning to cut off some of my fingers? Asked Dustfinger, tying the cord around Flatnose's legs. Basta shrugged. Since when does a man die of that? Blood loss? Eleanor jabbed the barrel of the gun into his ribs so hard that he stumbled back. Hear that? I think the boy's right. Maybe we really ought to shoot these thugs. But, of course, they didn't. They found a rope in the backpack that Flatnose had brought with him, and it gave Dustfinger obvious pleasure to tie up Basta. Farid helped him. He clearly knew something about tying up prisoners. Then they put Basta and Flatnose in the ruined house. Nice of us, right? The snakes won't find you quite so soon, said Dustfinger as they carried Basta through the narrow doorway. Of course, it'll get pretty hot in here around midday, but maybe someone will have found you by then. We'll let the dogs go. If they have any sense, they won't return to the village. But dogs don't often have much sense. So the whole gang will probably be out searching for you by this afternoon, at the latest. Flatnose did not come around until he was lying beside Basta under the ruined roof. He rolled his eyes furiously and went purple in the face, but neither he nor Basta could utter a sound because Farid had gagged them both, again, very expertly. Wait a minute, said Dustfinger before they left the two men to their fate. There's something else, something I've always wanted to do. And to Maggie's horror, he drew Basta's knife from his belt and went over to the prisoners with it. What's the idea? Asked Mo, barring his way. Obviously, the same thought had occurred to him as it had to Maggie, but Dustfinger only laughed. Don't worry, I'm not going to cut a pattern in his face the way he decorated mine, he said. I only wanted to scare him a little. And he'd already bent down to cut through the leather thong that Basta wore around his neck. It had a little bag closed with a red drawstring hanging from it. Dustfinger leaned over Basta and swung the bag back and forth in front of his face. I'm taking your luck, Basta, he said softly, straightening up. Now there's nothing to protect you from the evil eye and the ghosts and demons, black cats, and all the other things you're afraid of. Basta tried to kick out with his bound legs, but Dustfinger avoided him easily. This is goodbye forever, I hope, Basta, he said, and if our paths should ever cross again, then I'll have this. He tied the leather thong around his own neck. I expect there's a lock of your hair in it, right? No, well then perhaps I'll take one. Doesn't burning someone's hair have a terrible effect on him? That's enough, said Mo, urging him away. Let's get out of here. Who knows when Capricorn will realize these two are missing? By the way, did I tell you that he didn't burn quite all of the books? There's one copy of Inkheart left. Dustfinger stopped as suddenly as if a snake had bitten him.